War rewards the machines that move, and in 1944 none moved more doggedly than a small box-bodied creature of British invention, the Loyd Carrier. It was no hero's chariot, more a steel wheelbarrow with ambition. It rattled, smoked, and sulked in the rain, yet somehow refused to die. Built to haul guns, men, and hope across Europe's wreckage, it became the quiet pulse behind Britain's advance. Soldiers said it could tow anything except the conversation. In a war of roaring giants, this humble hauler whispered its way into history by doing the one thing it was born to do: keep moving. In 1939, as Europe began its second descent into chaos, the British Army carried one foot in the past and one in the mud. Its guns could fire for miles, but only if horses or heavy lorries could drag them into position. The tank, that symbol of modern warfare, was still treated as a glamorous outsider, expensive, temperamental, and forever demanding attention. What Britain lacked was something smaller, something that could fill the quiet spaces between the big machines. War exposes not just weakness in weapons, but weakness in imagination. The British Expeditionary Force learned that the hard way in France, when mobility proved just as vital as firepower. In those first desperate campaigns, a gun without movement was merely a monument. The army's logistical arteries were thin, slow, and easily cut. Something had to carry the weight, not of glory, but of continuity. The answer, when it came, was not found in the drawing rooms of generals, but in the workshops of men like Vivian Loyd. He had been designing small tracked vehicles since the 1920s, experimental little machines built for speed and practicality rather than spectacle. Britain, to its credit, recognized the virtue of such simplicity. There would be no sweeping curves, no grand innovation, just the quiet marriage of an engine, two tracks, and a purpose. The concept of a carrier vehicle was simple enough. It must move men, guns, and supplies anywhere, regardless of the road. But simplicity in theory is complexity in steel. To be light was to risk weakness. To be strong was to risk weight. The challenge was balance. The Loyd Carrier's low, rectangular frame offered exactly that: compact enough for transport, rugged enough for combat. It wasn't built to impress, but to endure. It was the automotive equivalent of dry humour, understated, reliable, and slightly allergic to praise. By 1940, Britain's industrial pulse had quickened. The Luftwaffe was overhead, the Channel glistened with the threat of invasion, and every vehicle that could crawl was pressed into service. The Ministry of Supply needed something cheap, standardized, and quick to build. The Loyd Carrier answered all three, using off-the-shelf Ford components that could be repaired with a hammer, a spanner, and a strong opinion. It wasn't built to win arguments, it was built to outlast them. When the first units rolled off the line, they looked unimpressive even by the modest standards of British engineering. No turret, no armour, no theatrics, just a machine that seemed to apologise for existing. Yet within months it had become indispensable. It towed the 6-pounder anti-tank gun, carried ammunition, and ferried troops across ground where trucks bogged and horses perished. What it lacked in charm, it repaid in loyalty. Soldiers didn't admire it, but they trusted it. And in war, trust is the rarest form of luxury. The need that created the Loyd Carrier wasn't for beauty or power, it was for endurance. A machine that could follow, support, and survive. The unsung middleman between strategy and survival. It may not have looked like much, but the story of the Loyd began with a truth Britain knew well. In the end, wars are not won by brilliance, but by stubbornness that moves on tracks. Every useful invention begins with an unglamorous question. For the Loyd Carrier, that question was, how do you make mobility ordinary? Britain didn't need a marvel, it needed a method. Tanks might break the enemy, but carriers kept the army from breaking itself. Behind the lines, in drafty offices and cold workshops, the vision was quietly practical. Build a vehicle so simple it could never be misunderstood. Vivian Loyd had been chasing this idea for years. His earlier Carden-Loyd designs had set the tone for a generation of light-tracked vehicles across the world, influencing everything from Soviet tankettes to Japanese reconnaissance machines. But the war transformed theory into urgency. His new concept was stripped of all pretense: an engine, 2 tracks, and just enough armour to stop a careless screwdriver. It wasn't about bravery or bravado, it was about engineering clarity. The army wanted a carrier that could serve everyone and belong to no one. Adaptable, multi-purpose, a mechanical servant. The result was a vehicle that blurred the boundaries of classification. It wasn't quite a tractor, not quite an armoured car, not quite a truck. It was something in between, a universal link in the chain of war. It was what happened when British design philosophy met British pessimism and decided to compromise halfway. Design meetings in 1940 were less about dreams and more about survival. Steel was rationed, rubber was scarce, and the Ministry of Supply had the patience of a field sergeant. Lloyd's design was chosen precisely because it was uncomplicated. It could be built by almost any factory already turning out cars or light machinery. Ford's V8 engine was selected not for power, but for ubiquity, the kind of engine that could be fixed anywhere in the empire with a wrench and a curse. The layout was deliberate minimalism. Driver to the left, commander beside him, engine behind, a pattern so efficient it would be copied long after the war. The rear compartment could be adapted to almost any role: gun towing, cable laying, ambulance work, or simply carting crates of ammunition across a battlefield. Soldiers would later joke that the only thing it couldn't carry was enthusiasm, but that too was its genius. A machine with no ego could serve any master. Its appearance reflected its purpose: all function, no ceremony. There was no turret to polish, no armour plate to admire. What you saw was what you got: a rectangular frame on 2 tracks, painted the same shade of resignation as the British sky. If beauty is truth, then this was a very honest vehicle. The vision that produced the Loyd Carrier was not romantic. It was utilitarian, almost cynical, and perfectly British. In an age when machines were built to symbolize power, the Loyd symbolized persistence. It wasn't designed to win medals, it was designed to make sure others could. That, perhaps, was its truest innovation, a machine whose greatness lay in the fact that it never needed to prove it. The factories that built the Loyd Carrier didn't hum with pride, they groaned with exhaustion. Britain, in the early 1940s, was an island of production wrapped in blackout curtains. Steelworks glowed through the night, machine tools shrieked, and the scent of hot oil clung to everything. In this noise and pressure, the Loyd Carrier was assembled, not as a masterpiece, but as a necessity. Production began under a philosophy that would later define British wartime engineering: make it fast, make it simple, and make it work. The design lent itself perfectly to the task. The chassis was welded in flat panels rather than curved castings. The engine was borrowed from Ford's commercial line. Even the steering mechanism was a repurposed truck system adapted for tracks. It was a vehicle built by men who no longer cared about elegance, only results. This was not an age of artisans. It was an age of deadlines. Unlike tanks, which demanded specialized factories and rare alloys, the Loyd could be turned out by ordinary automotive plants. Wolseley, Ford, and the British Motor Corporation all joined the effort. Assembly lines once dedicated to sedans now produced the sturdiest mudsloggers of the war. Each vehicle emerged half complete. Engines here, bodies there, then shipped by rail to be married together like an industrial jigsaw puzzle. Britain was improvising at scale, and the Loyd became the proof that improvisation could outproduce perfection. Mechanically, the Carrier was almost endearing in its simplicity. 2 tracks powered by a single V8 engine, rear-drive transmission, and leaf spring suspension gave it the gait of a determined animal. It wasn't fast, but it could cross ground that made heavier vehicles sink. Its open hull design allowed mechanics to reach almost any part of it in minutes, a rare blessing on a battlefield where time was measured in explosions. When something broke, it didn't demand an engineer. It demanded a screwdriver and a complaint. Every factory foreman knew the rhythm by heart: rivet, weld, test, repeat. Inspectors paced the lines with clipboards, counting success by the hour. The first models rolled out in 1940. By 1943, tens of thousands had followed. Each bore the quiet fingerprints of dozens of anonymous hands, the unseen army behind the army. For many workers, the Loyd Carrier was their connection to the front, their proof that industry could fight even when flesh could not. The build process itself became a kind of morale. It was tangible, mechanical proof that Britain was still moving, still producing, still holding on. Where precision had once ruled, now pragmatism reigned. Engineers spoke of tolerance not as a measurement, but as an attitude. The Loyd wasn't perfect, but it was ready, and readiness was worth more than beauty. By 1944, the lines could produce a new Carrier in less than a day. From steel plate to battlefield took less than a fortnight, and every one of them, no matter how dented or dusty, carried the same purpose: keep the guns rolling, keep the men supplied, and keep Britain's war alive. The factories didn't build fame. They built endurance on tracks. A machine is only an idea until the first shell lands near it. For the Loyd Carrier, its real examination began in the mud and din of the Western Front, where reliability wasn't a specification. It was survival. The first production models rolled into service with British and Commonwealth forces in 1940, often to tow the 6-pounder anti-tank gun. It was a humble assignment, but one that mattered. Every gun it pulled was a promise that infantry wouldn't stand alone. The test of design came not in laboratories, but in the fields of France, the deserts of North Africa, and later the hedgerows of Normandy. Soldiers discovered that the Loyd's unassuming build was its greatest virtue. It was light enough to load on a lorry, small enough to hide behind a hedge, and just powerful enough to pull something that shouldn't logically move. It looked like a garden shed on tracks, and performed about as gracefully. But it refused to stop. The driver's view was minimal, the seating Spartan, and the noise continuous. In theory, the Carrier's open top allowed better visibility. In practice, it offered a fine collection of rainwater and incoming dust. But the troops adapted. They lined the thin steel with sandbags, bolted on makeshift covers, and treated each vehicle as an extension of their will. A Loyd in the field was not just a machine. It was a companion that groaned, rattled, and got the job done. Commanders soon realized its potential beyond towing. The Carrier became a messenger of mobility, carrying signals equipment, laying cables, even ferrying ammunition under fire. It filled every gap that logistics could not anticipate. When bridges failed or roads vanished under shell fire, the Loyd found a way through. It was the British answer to an impossible question: what if necessity had tracks? In North Africa, its tracks bit through sand where lorries choked. In Italy, it climbed slopes that left men gasping. In Normandy, it followed the tanks through smoke and shrapnel, dragging the war's lifelines behind it. Crews painted names on the sides: Faith, Grinder, Tea Break. not out of affection, but as a gesture of defiance. If they had to live with the thing, they might as well pretend it had a sense of humour. The Loyd's success wasn't measured in speed or glamour. It was measured in continuity, in how often it reached the guns, in how rarely it failed. The men trusted it because it behaved predictably. It didn't argue, didn't boast, didn't promise more than it could give, and that made it invaluable. By the time of Operation Goodwood in 1944, the Loyd Carrier had become the quiet workhorse of the British Army's logistical system. It couldn't storm a position or fire a shot, but it ensured that those who did could keep doing so. Its trial by fire proved something that no committee could have planned, that endurance, not elegance, was the true test of design. When the battles paused and the dust settled, the Loyd would be there, engine ticking, tracks sagging, paint scorched, waiting to move again. It was the machine that never asked what came next, because it already knew. Every machine reaches a moment when purpose and limitation collide. For the Loyd Carrier, that moment came in the summer of 1944, when Allied forces pushed from the beaches of Normandy into the broken heart of Europe. The roads were ruins, the fields sodden, and the air thick with cordite. Heavy armour led the charge, but it was the carriers that kept the guns alive behind them. The Loyd's small frame became its greatest strength. It could squeeze down farm lanes where Shermans bogged and snake through debris where trucks lost their axles. In the hierarchy of war, it sat low, a servant among giants. But in that humility lay its triumph. Commanders soon realized that supply lines depended more on the modest carriers than on the glamorous tanks. They moved ammunition, fuel, rations, and wounded men with relentless regularity. It didn't break records, it broke mud. Its mechanical reliability astonished even the skeptics. The Ford V8 engine proved remarkably forgiving, running for hundreds of hours under abuse that would have made most engines pack up in protest. Crews learned its quirks, and in return, it rarely betrayed them. The open hull that looked like a design flaw turned out to be practical, fast to load, quick to repair, and easy to repurpose. Within a year, the Loyd had earned a reputation as the Army's invisible bloodstream. Yet success bred its own problems. Production numbers soared beyond 26,000, and variations multiplied. Cable layers, artillery tractors, observation posts, even carriers fitted for signals and ammunition duties. This adaptability was its genius, but also its curse. Some units overloaded the vehicles or sent them into roles they were never meant for. The result was mechanical fatigue and the occasional spectacular failure. One officer noted it handled like a bath on caterpillars, which, technically, wasn't far off. Even so, its operational record spoke louder than its critics. During the push through Belgium and the Netherlands, carriers could be seen crawling through towns that had been bombed to rubble, their tracks clattering over bricks and broken glass. They weren't symbols of victory, they were symbols of persistence. Each one was a statement that the British war machine, for all its shortages and compromises, still worked. The real breakthrough was philosophical. The Loyd proved that military success didn't depend solely on big guns or heavy armour. It depended on continuity. For every tank that thundered forward, there had to be a dozen smaller machines ensuring it could keep going. That realization reshaped British doctrine, embedding logistics as the quiet equal of combat. By late 1944, the Loyd's place in history was secured not by a single battle, but by 1,000 small victories of motion. It was the tractor that never rested, the carrier that never asked for ceremony. In a war defined by spectacle, it succeeded by being utterly unspectacular. Its breakthrough was not a moment of glory, but a long grind of usefulness. The kind of achievement that keeps armies alive and engineers honest. And for Britain, fighting on rations, that was enough. Victory hides its accountants. When the war turned in Britain's favour, few paused to consider the machines that had carried the burden. The Loyd Carrier, by then spread across continents, had become the quiet backbone of an empire at war. From Europe's hedgerows to the jungles of Burma, its tracks marked the slow, methodical advance of supply lines. But success came with a paradox. The better the carrier performed, the less attention it received. This was the hidden consequence of reliability. The Loyd was so effective, so ordinary, that it disappeared into the background of history. It was the engineering equivalent of a good waiter, noticed only when something went wrong. The official histories celebrated the tanks, the Spitfires, the bombers, and the great commanders. Few pages were spared for the little hauler that kept them all moving. Yet the economics of the war told a different story. Production costs were low, maintenance minimal, and its mechanical endurance astonishing. The return on investment was a logistician's dream, but the industrial miracle that made it possible also left a scar. Factories that had built cars and tools before the war were now churning out carriers at breakneck speed. Civilian industries were reshaped into instruments of conflict, and when peace returned, thousands of workers faced redundancy. Britain's manufacturing heart had proved its worth, but at a cost, its rhythm now set to the tempo of war. Meanwhile, the carriers themselves lingered across the globe. Many were sold or repurposed, others abandoned in depots or fields. A few were given to Allied nations struggling to rebuild. Some ended their lives as farm tractors, stripped of their armour and pressed into peacetime labour. They went from pulling guns to pulling ploughs, proof that even war machines can be domesticated if they survive long enough. The psychological consequence was subtler. Soldiers who had relied on their carriers often felt a strange loyalty to them, an attachment born of mud, noise, and mutual endurance. Veterans recalled the smell of hot oil, the rough vibration underfoot, the strange comfort of motion amid chaos. Yet, as new vehicles replaced them and old ones rusted away, the memory of the Loyd faded from public consciousness. It became part of the background hum of victory, essential, invisible, and forgotten. Even governments forgot. Records were misplaced, models scrapped, prototypes lost. For decades, the Loyd existed only in fragments, a photograph here, a museum label there. And perhaps that was fitting. It had never sought the spotlight. It had always lived in the margins between necessity and neglect. The hidden consequence of its success was its anonymity. In making movement routine, it made itself invisible. The army had wanted a machine that could go anywhere, and in history it did exactly that, everywhere and nowhere at all. When the guns finally fell silent, the Loyd Carrier faced a future as uncertain as the peace it had helped deliver. Britain, weary and broke, dismantled its wartime machinery with ruthless efficiency. The great fleets of tanks were sold, scrapped, or sent abroad. The carriers, smaller and simpler, followed quietly behind them. Many were left on European soil, rusting among the ruins they once helped to cross. Yet some escaped that fate. On farms from Kent to Canada, the Loyd found new life as a tractor, a hauler, or even a makeshift bulldozer. Its Ford engine, crude but dependable, kept running through frost and rain long after its service number had been painted over. It survived peace the same way it survived war, by pretending to be less important than it was. Collectors and engineers began to notice the survivors in the 1950s and 60s. Museums restored a few, veterans restored more. In sheds and workshops across Britain, a new generation discovered the understated genius of its design, a machine that could be dismantled with basic tools and rebuilt with patience. Every restored carrier became a time capsule, each dent and weld a record of improvisation under fire. The Loyd's legacy stretched further than its steel. It changed how armies thought about movement. Post-war doctrine adopted its lesson wholesale, that small, modular vehicles were vital to maintaining flexibility in the field. The post-war tracked Loyd Carrier and even modern logistics support vehicles trace their lineage back to this humble machine. The idea that mobility should be universal, not reserved for tanks or generals, was its quiet revolution. The engineering world took note as well. Simplicity, once a byword for cheapness, became a virtue again. The Loyd had proven that reliability didn't need glamour, it needed accessibility. Its greatest innovation was that it could be fixed by anyone brave enough to open the bonnet. Designers who studied its blueprints saw not elegance, but honesty, and that honesty became the foundation of Britain's post-war mechanical philosophy. Today, the few remaining examples still clatter across showgrounds, their exhaust notes sharp and metallic, their tracks biting gently into the earth. Children stare, veterans smile, and engineers nod in recognition. The sight is not majestic, it's mechanical humility in motion. Every working carrier is a reminder that the machinery of war is not just destruction, it's endurance given form. Its legacy is not carved in marble or bronze, but in grease and iron, the language it always spoke best. The Loyd Carrier didn't conquer nations, it connected them. It made logistics an act of faith and engineering an act of service. And that is why, though its name faded from the headlines, its influence never left the ground it once crossed. Time has a way of burying the unremarkable. The great engines of war are remembered in museums and documentaries. The quiet carriers vanish into the footnotes. Yet, if you trace the threads of every major operation, every advance and every stand, the Loyd Carrier appears like a shadow, always there, always moving. It did not define the war, but it made the war possible. The carrier was, in its own strange way, a philosophy on tracks. It embodied the idea that progress does not always announce itself with noise or ceremony. Britain's engineers built it to be used, abused, and eventually forgotten, a disposable servant in a disposable age, and yet, against all logic, it outlived its moment. Some machines are designed to last, others are simply too stubborn to stop. Look closely at a surviving Loyd today, and you'll see more than rust. You'll see the welds of urgency, the bolts tightened in haste, the paint layered over by exhaustion. Each mark is a testament to a time when survival depended on motion. The men who rode in them didn't see history. They saw mud, cold, and duty. The carrier didn't inspire affection, but it earned respect. And respect, in war, is rarer than victory. The deeper meaning of the Loyd lies in what it taught about humility. Modern warfare is filled with noise, missiles, jets, politics, but its success still rests on the quiet logistics beneath it. The carrier was the proof that small machines, like small decisions, carry the weight of empires. In a world obsessed with breakthroughs, it was content to be the follow-through. To understand the Loyd is to understand the British temperament at war, pragmatic, weary, and quietly effective. It never pretended to be magnificent. It simply worked until it couldn't, and then someone fixed it so it could again. In that rhythm, break, mend, move, lay the pulse of the entire war effort. When historians look back, they see the tides of strategy and the personalities of generals. But between those tides rolled the carriers, unsung, uncelebrated, unstoppable. Their story is the story of function triumphing over form, and endurance triumphing over expectation. In the end, the Loyd Carrier's legacy isn't measured in medals or monuments, but in the silence it left behind. The silence of a machine that asked for nothing, achieved everything, and disappeared exactly as it lived, modestly, mechanically, and utterly essential.